Montana Territory, 1876. The town of Silveridge sat nestled between rolling prairie and the jagged teeth of distant mountains, a place where civilization was still more aspiration than reality. Summer dust coated everything, turning the world sepia-toned except for the occasional flash of color from a lady's dress or the brilliant blue of the endless western sky. Ross Fullman believed two things with absolute certainty: that a man survived in this territory by keeping to himself, and that letting anyone close was a fool's path to heartbreak or an early grave. At 25, he'd already seen enough death and disappointment to last several lifetimes. The war had taken his father, the fever his mother, and the unforgiving land had claimed his older brother 3 winters past. What remained was his small cattle operation, a decent reputation as one of the most skilled horsemen in the county, and a resolute commitment to self-reliance. A man needs nothing but his horse, his gun, and enough sense to use both properly, he often told himself while riding the boundaries of his modest spread 10 miles outside town. The words had become something of a prayer, a shield against the occasional loneliness that crept in during the long winter nights or when he watched families gather after Sunday services. Ross wasn't unfriendly. He maintained cordial relations with the townspeople, traded fairly with the local Blackfoot tribe, and even joined the occasional community barn raising, but he kept a careful distance. Close enough to be considered a decent neighbor, distant enough that no one expected more. It was safer that way. The Montana Territory devoured the weak and sentimental. When he rode into town that late June morning, his intentions were straightforward: sell some horses to the stage company, purchase supplies, and return to his ranch before nightfall. The pattern had served him well for years: predictable, safe, solitary. What wasn't predictable was the young woman stepping off the eastbound train, her emerald green traveling dress catching the morning light as she surveyed Silveridge with a mixture of trepidation and determination. Beatrice Grayson, 22 years old with honey blonde hair pinned carefully beneath a modest hat, clutched her small valise and took a deep breath of the Montana air. It smelled of dust, pine, and possibility, so different from the coal smoke and crowds of Philadelphia. The journey had been long, her nerves frayed, and the lie she'd prepared about her reasons for coming to this remote town sat uncomfortably in her throat. "Miss, do you need assistance with your luggage?" The station manager approached, gesturing to the single trunk being unloaded from the baggage car. "Yes, thank you, I'll need that taken to Mrs. Whittaker's boarding house," she replied, consulting a small slip of paper in her gloved hand. "I believe she's expecting me." The mention of Mrs. Whittaker's establishment caught Ross's attention as he secured his dun gelding to the hitching post outside the general store across the street. The boarding house owner only accepted female boarders with impeccable references, typically schoolteachers or the occasional widow with means. This newcomer didn't strike him as either, though there was something refined in her posture and speech that marked her as educated. Not his business, he reminded himself. Silveridge had grown considerably over the past 2 years, with the new silver mine bringing fresh faces monthly. One more eastern transplant hardly warranted notice. He turned his attention back to his errands. Until fate, or more accurately, a spooked draft horse pulling a delivery wagon, intervened. The massive Clydesdale reared suddenly as a dog darted across its path, sending the wagon lurching forward directly toward the distracted young woman still standing on the platform. "Look out," Ross shouted, already moving. His voice carried across the street, sharp and commanding. Beatrice turned, her eyes widening at the runaway horse and wagon bearing down on her. She froze, paralyzed by fear as the massive wheels rumbled toward her. In 3 long strides, Ross reached her, wrapping one arm around her waist and pulling her clear of the platform just as the wagon crashed against it, splintering the wooden boards where she'd stood seconds earlier. The momentum carried them both into the dusty street, Ross twisting to take the brunt of their fall. For a moment they lay there, his arms still around her waist, her golden hair having come partially unpinned and cascading across his chest. Her eyes, a startling shade of blue-green like mountain lakes, stared up at him with shock and something else, a flicker of recognition quickly masked. "Are you hurt, miss?" Ross asked, his voice lower now, concern evident beneath the controlled exterior. Beatrice felt a warmth creep into her cheeks at the sound. That voice, deep, slightly rough around the edges but gentle despite its strength, She'd imagined it differently, but there was no mistaking it now. I'm quite all right, thanks to you," she managed, struggling to compose herself as she became acutely aware of their position in the middle of the street, his strong arm still supporting her. "Though I fear my dignity may be somewhat compromised." Ross helped her to her feet, noticing with curiosity the blush that had spread across her cheeks. Likely just the excitement of her near miss, he reasoned, though something about the way she averted her eyes made him wonder. "Ross Fullman," he offered with a slight nod, releasing her once she was steady. "Welcome to Silveridge, miss." "Grayson, Beatrice Grayson," she smoothed her skirts, trying to regain her composure. "It seems I owe you my gratitude for such a dramatic welcome, Mr. Fullman." "No debt owed for common decency," he replied, retrieving her hat which had fallen in their tumble. "Though you might consider watching for runaway wagons in the future. Silveridge isn't Philadelphia or Boston." Her eyebrows rose slightly. "How did you know I'm from the East?" "Your boots," he said with the ghost of a smile. "Too fine for our mud and not nearly worn enough for someone who's spent time out here." The small crowd that had gathered began to disperse as the wagon driver profusely apologized, the excitement concluding without serious harm. Mrs. Whittaker herself appeared, a stern-looking woman in her 50s who had apparently witnessed the incident from her porch. "Miss Grayson, I presume," she approached with quick, efficient steps. "I see you've already met our Mr. Fullman. One of the few gentlemen in this territory worthy of the title." Ross nodded politely to the boarding house proprietress, Mrs. Whittaker. "I was just about to escort Miss Grayson to my establishment," the older woman continued. "She's come to work at the new school, quite fortunate timing with autumn term approaching." Beatrice's eyes darted briefly to Mrs. Whittaker, a flicker of something, relief, gratitude, crossing her features. "Yes, that's right. I've come to teach." Ross noticed the slight hesitation before her confirmation, so brief anyone else might have missed it. Teaching might indeed be her intention, but something in her manner suggested there was more to Beatrice Grayson's arrival in Silveridge than educating frontier children. "Well, Miss Grayson, I wish you luck with your position," he said, tipping his hat. "Our town could use more education and refinement." "Thank you, Mr. Fullman. Perhaps we'll cross paths again under less dramatic circumstances." Perhaps, he agreed, though he doubted it. Ross made it a point to avoid entanglements with newcomers, especially attractive young women with secrets behind their eyes. He had his ranch, his horses, and his solitude, all he needed to survive in the unforgiving territory. As he watched Mrs. Whittaker lead Beatrice away, he couldn't help but notice how the young woman glanced back over her shoulder at him, that curious blush returning to her cheeks when their eyes met briefly. Odd, he thought. Almost as if she already knew him somehow. Ross dismissed the notion and returned to his errands. Beatrice Grayson and whatever had brought her to Silveridge was none of his concern. The Montana Territory had taught him one lesson above all others. Those who minded their own business tended to live longer, happier lives. Little did he know that his carefully constructed isolation was about to face its greatest challenge, and that the woman with honey-blonde hair and a questionable story about teaching school would append everything he thought he knew about survival in the West. 3 days later, Ross found himself reluctantly attending Silveridge's 4th of July celebration. He typically avoided such gatherings, preferring the quiet of his ranch to the boisterous festivities in town. But Sheriff Miller had personally requested his presence, citing the need for level-headed men, given the tensions between some of the miners and the ranchers over water rights. "Just show your face, have a meal, maybe dance with a respectable lady or two," the sheriff had said. "Remind folks you're part of this community." So here he was, uncomfortable in his best shirt and string tie, nursing a mug of lemonade as fiddle music filled the town square and children ran with sparklers in the early evening light. Ross kept to the periphery, nodding acknowledgments to those he knew while maintaining his characteristic distance. Until he spotted Beatrice Grayson across the square, her golden hair arranged in an elegant knot, wearing a sky-blue dress that made her eyes appear even more striking than he remembered. She was speaking animatedly with several townswomen, presumably other teachers or perhaps mothers of future students. Even from a distance, he could see how she captivated her audience, her hands gesturing gracefully to emphasize whatever tale she was sharing. When she laughed, the sound carried across the square, genuine and warm. Something about it tugged at him, a distant memory he couldn't quite place. Quite the addition to our little community, wouldn't you say? Ross turned to find Judge Hammond beside him, the older man's eyes crinkling with amusement. Mrs. Whittaker speaks very highly of her credentials, Ross replied neutrally. I'm sure the children will benefit from proper schooling. Indeed, though I must say, it's curious for such an accomplished young lady to seek a teaching position in our remote corner of the territory. Especially given her family connections. Ross raised an eyebrow. Family connections. The judge nodded, lowering his voice slightly. Her father is apparently Thaddeus Grayson, the railroad magnate, or was, God rest his soul. Passed away last winter, from what I understand. The name was familiar to Ross, as it would be to anyone who followed the expansion of the railroads. Thaddeus Grayson had been one of the wealthy Eastern investors who had helped finance the transcontinental line. What would the daughter of such wealth be doing teaching school in Silveridge? Ross mused aloud, more to himself than the judge. Adventure, rebellion, a broken heart, Judge Hammond shrugged. Young ladies of means sometimes seek independence in unusual ways, though between you and me, I suspect there's more to her story than she's letting on. Before Ross could respond, the fiddle music changed tempo, shifting to a lively reel as couples began forming sets for dancing. Well, I believe Mrs. Hammond is expecting me for this dance, the judge said with a smile. You might consider asking Miss Grayson for a turn, show our newcomer some Western hospitality. Ross had no intention of doing any such thing. Dancing led to conversation, conversation to connection, and connection inevitably to disappointment or worse. He had planned to finish his lemonade and make a discreet exit back to his ranch. That plan dissolved when he found Beatrice suddenly standing before him, those remarkable eyes regarding him with a mixture of determination and what appeared to be nervousness. Mr. Fullman, she said, her voice steady despite the slight flush in her cheeks. I was hoping we might speak privately for a moment. Curiosity overcame his better judgment. Of course, Miss Grayson. He led her to a quieter corner of the square, away from the dancers and merrymakers. The setting sun cast long shadows across the ground, painting the world in amber and gold. I wanted to thank you properly for your assistance the other day, she began, her gloved hands clasped tightly before her. It was quite heroic. As I said then, no thanks necessary, he replied. Anyone would have done the same. Perhaps. But it was you who did, she paused, seeming to gather her courage for something more significant than expressions of gratitude. Mr. Fullman, I must confess that I wasn't entirely truthful about why I've come to Silveridge. Ross felt a flicker of wariness. Your reasons are your own, Miss Grayson. Ordinarily, yes, but in this case, she took a deep breath. I came here looking for you. The admission hung in the air between them. Ross studied her face, searching for signs of deception but finding only genuine apprehension. I don't understand, he said carefully. We've never met before. Not in person, no, but I recognize your voice. She met his gaze directly now. 3 years ago, during a blizzard near Fort Laramie, you saved my father's life when his coach overturned in the snow. You brought him to safety, cared for his injuries, and refused any reward. The memory surfaced slowly, a brutal winter storm, an overturned stagecoach he'd happened upon while delivering horses to the fort, an older gentleman with a broken leg and dangerous exposure to the cold. Ross had indeed brought the man to shelter at a trapper's cabin, tended his wounds as best he could until the weather cleared, then helped arrange transport back to civilization once the storm passed. Your father was Thaddeus Grayson, Ross said, the pieces falling into place. She nodded. He spoke often of the young cowboy who saved him and asked for nothing in return. He said your voice was one he'd never forget, calm and authoritative even in crisis. When I heard you shout that warning at the station, I knew immediately it was you. Ross shifted uncomfortably, unused to being the object of such focused attention. That still doesn't explain why you've traveled all this way, Miss Grayson. If it was simply to express gratitude, a letter would have sufficed. My father tried to find you afterward to properly thank you. But you'd only given your first name, and by the time his inquiries began, you'd moved on from Wyoming. Her expression grew more serious. Before he died, my father asked me to fulfill a promise he made, to find you and deliver something he believed you deserved. Ross's discomfort deepened. He didn't like the direction this conversation was taking. Miss Grayson, I meant what I said at the time. I want no reward for basic human decency. It's not charity, Mr. Fullman, she said firmly. It's fulfilling a debt of honor. My father was not a man who left such debts unpaid. Before Ross could protest further, Sheriff Miller approached, his expression apologetic for the interruption. Sorry to disturb you folks, but I need a word with Ross, he said, tipping his hat to Beatrice. Trouble brewing with some of Carson's boys over by the saloon. Ross nodded, torn between relief at the interruption and curiosity about Beatrice's mission. We'll have to continue this conversation another time, Miss Grayson. Tomorrow, she said quickly, I'll be at the schoolhouse in the afternoon preparing for the term. Perhaps you could call then. Against his better judgment, he found himself agreeing. Until tomorrow, then. As he walked away with the sheriff, Ross couldn't help but wonder what Thaddeus Grayson could possibly have left that would send his daughter across the country to deliver it. More importantly, he wondered why the thought of seeing her again caused such an unsettling mixture of anticipation and dread. The Montana Territory had no place for complications, and Beatrice Grayson was rapidly becoming the most intriguing complication he'd encountered in years. The schoolhouse stood at the edge of town, a simple white clapboard building with a bell tower that had been completed just the previous autumn. As Ross approached the following afternoon, he could hear the sound of someone playing the small pump organ inside, a haunting rendition of Beautiful Dreamer that seemed to catch on the summer breeze. He paused at the doorway, watching as Beatrice sat at the instrument, her back to him, fingers moving skillfully over the keys. The afternoon light streamed through the windows, surrounding her in a golden glow that made her appear almost ethereal. For a moment he simply listened, struck by the contrast between this refined Eastern woman and the rough-hewn frontier town she'd chosen to inhabit. When the final notes faded, he cleared his throat gently. That was beautiful, Miss Grayson. She turned quickly, a smile brightening her face when she saw him. Mr. Fullman, you came. I gave my word, he replied simply, removing his hat as he stepped into the schoolroom. It smelled of fresh lumber, chalk, and the lavender scent he now associated with Beatrice. Yes, I'm learning that means something significant out here. She rose from the organ bench, smoothing the front of her simple navy dress. Thank you for coming. I realize yesterday's conversation was unexpected. You've certainly piqued my curiosity, he admitted, keeping a respectful distance as he glanced around the classroom with its rows of new desks and the large slate board mounted on the wall. Though I'm still not comfortable with the idea of any reward. I understand your reluctance. She moved to her teacher's desk where a leather document case lay, but perhaps you'll allow me to explain properly before making your decision. Ross nodded, his caution battling with an uncharacteristic desire to know more about this woman and her connection to his past good deed. After you saved my father, she began, he spent considerable effort trying to locate you. The description from Fort Laramie was of a young horseman named Ross who had delivered remounts to the cavalry and was heading to Montana Territory. Not much to go on. I wasn't trying to be mysterious, Ross said, just didn't see the need for formalities in a survival situation. Nevertheless, it frustrated him greatly not to properly thank the man who saved his life. My father was determined in his gratitude. A fond smile crossed her features. When his health began to fail last winter, he asked me to promise I would complete what he called his unfinished business, finding you being chief among those matters. She opened the leather case and removed several folded documents bearing official seals. When the railroad was surveying routes through this territory, my father acquired certain land parcels as investments, she continued. One of those parcels happens to adjoin your ranch, Mr. Fullman. Ross stiffened. The north section. The watershed land. She nodded. 500 acres, including the headwaters of Fuller Creek that runs through your property. His jaw tightened. That parcel had been a thorn in his side for years. prime grazing land with reliable water, but owned by some distant investor who ignored all inquiries about purchase. Without access to those headwaters, his ranch remained vulnerable to drought and limited in its potential expansion. "And your father left this land to you," he concluded, beginning to understand. "No, Mr. Fullman," she held out the documents, "he left it to you." Ross stared at the papers, making no move to take them. "That's impossible. That land is worth a small fortune, especially with the railroad spur line coming through the valley." "Its value is precisely why my father wished you to have it," she insisted. He said a man who would risk his life for a stranger without expectation of reward deserved far more than he could ever repay. But this, at least, might make a meaningful difference to your future. The gesture was so unexpected, so contrary to Ross's experience of the world, that he found himself momentarily speechless. In his years in the territory, he'd learned that nothing came without strings, that generosity typically masked ulterior motives, and that the land itself had to be earned through sweat and sacrifice. "Miss Grayson," he finally said, his voice carefully controlled, "I appreciate the sentiment behind your father's bequest, but I cannot accept such an extravagant gift for doing what any decent man would have done." Her expression fell slightly. "I anticipated you might say that, which is why I came in person rather than simply sending these documents with a lawyer." She set the papers down on the desk. "Will you at least consider it? Perhaps ride the land with me tomorrow, so I can explain fully what my father intended." The request was reasonable enough, and Ross found himself reluctant to disappoint her after she'd traveled so far. Besides, seeing the watershed land up close, land he'd only viewed from its boundaries, was tempting regardless of the circumstances. "I can spare tomorrow morning," he conceded. "I'll meet you at Mrs. Whittaker's at 8 if that suits." Her smile returned, genuine and warm. "That would be perfect, I'll be ready." As he turned to leave, a question that had been nagging at him surfaced. "Miss Grayson, are you actually planning to teach school here, or was that merely a convenient explanation for your presence in Silveridge?" She looked surprised by the question. "Oh, I am indeed the new teacher. I have the credentials and experience, and the position offers me independence while I determine my next steps." "Next steps?" A shadow crossed her face. "My father's passing has changed many things in my life, Mr. Fullman. The expectations placed upon me, the constraints of Philadelphia society, they've become rather suffocating. Teaching here provides a respite while I fulfill my promise and consider my future." There was more to her story than she was sharing, but Ross recognized the boundaries of privacy. Everyone in the West carried secrets or sorrows. It was an unwritten code to respect such things unless invited to discuss them. "Until tomorrow, then, Miss Grayson." "Until tomorrow, Mr. Fullman." She hesitated, then added softly, "And thank you truly for what you did for my father. Whatever you decide about the land, please know that your actions gave him 3 more years of life that he cherished deeply." As Ross mounted his horse outside the schoolhouse, he couldn't help but feel that his carefully ordered existence was being disrupted by Beatrice Grayson's arrival. The land offer was problematic enough, too valuable to accept comfortably, too potentially crucial to his ranch's future to dismiss outright. But more unsettling was his growing awareness that something about this Eastern woman with her direct gaze and hidden depths was beginning to breach the walls he'd built around himself since his brother's death. The territory had no place for such complications, he reminded himself. Yet as he rode back to his ranch, the memory of Beatrice's smile and the haunting notes of "beautiful dreamer" accompanied him, refusing to be dismissed as easily as he would have wished. The morning dawned clear and unusually cool for July, with a gentle breeze stirring the prairie grasses as Ross approached Mrs. Whittaker's boarding house. He'd spent a restless night considering Beatrice's revelation about the land and questioning his own judgment in agreeing to this excursion. Riding alone with an unmarried woman of quality was pushing the boundaries of propriety, even by the territory's relaxed standards. His concerns were partially alleviated when he found not only Beatrice waiting on the porch, but Mrs. Whittaker herself, along with a sturdy bay mare already saddled. "Good morning, Mr. Fullman," the older woman called, her tone managing to be both welcoming and faintly warning. "Miss Grayson mentioned your plans to inspect the watershed property. I've taken the liberty of preparing a small picnic for your journey." The implication was clear, Mrs. Whittaker knew of their expedition and had tacitly approved it with the provision of food and a properly saddled mount, and the understanding that her boarder's reputation would return intact. "Much appreciated, Mrs. Whittaker," Ross replied with a respectful nod. "We'll be back by early afternoon." Beatrice emerged from the house dressed in a practical riding habit of deep burgundy, her honey-blonde hair braided and pinned securely beneath a modest hat. Ross was struck by how the outfit, while still undeniably Eastern in its tailoring, showed thoughtful adaptation to frontier conditions. "Good morning, Mr. Fullman," she said, her cheeks slightly flushed with anticipation. "I hope I haven't kept you waiting." "Not at all," he assured her, dismounting to help secure the picnic basket behind her saddle. "The weather's perfect for riding. Cool enough that we won't feel the heat in the open country." Mrs. Whittaker fussed briefly with Beatrice's collar. "Remember what I said, dear, keep to the main trails, be back before the afternoon heat, and maintain all proper decorum," Beatrice finished with a smile that suggested this wasn't the first such admonition she'd received that morning. "I assure you, Mrs. Whittaker, Mr. Fullman is a gentleman, and I have no intention of compromising either of our reputations." The older woman harumphed softly, "See that you don't. This town has too few respectable young people as it is." Ross helped Beatrice mount the mare, noting with approval her confident seat and the ease with which she gathered the reins. When their hands briefly touched during the assist, he felt an unexpected spark of awareness that he quickly dismissed as imagination. They rode out of town at an easy pace, Beatrice managing her mount with the skill of someone who had spent considerable time in the saddle. The morning sun cast long shadows across the trail as they headed northwest toward the foothills and the contested watershed land. "You ride well for an Easterner," Ross observed after they'd cleared the town limits. "My father believed women should be accomplished in practical skills, not just ornamental ones," she replied, "though I admit my experience has been limited to manicured bridle paths rather than open country." "The mare seems to approve of your technique," he noted, nodding toward her mount's relaxed ears and steady gait. "Animals are better judges of competence than most people. A philosophy that serves well in both East and West, I imagine." She glanced at him with genuine curiosity. "How long have you been in the territory, Mr. Fullman?" "Nearly 10 years now," he answered, calculating briefly. "Came out after the war with my brother to start fresh. He'd fought for the Union, had seen enough of civilization's supposed advantages." "And you, did you also serve?" Ross shook his head. "Too young, my father went in my place, didn't come home. By the time I was old enough, it was nearly over." Old guilt colored his voice despite his best efforts. "I'm sorry about your father," Beatrice said softly, her tone free of the judgment he sometimes encountered when explaining his lack of military service. They rode in companionable silence for a while, the rhythmic sound of hoofbeats punctuated by meadowlarks calling from the tall grass. The landscape opened before them, rolling hills giving way to steeper terrain as they approached the foothills, the distant mountains sharp and clear in the morning light. "It's beautiful," Beatrice murmured, almost to herself. "So vast and untamed, yet there's an order to it, a harmony that's missing in the crowded streets back east." Ross found himself nodding. "That's what my brother Michael used to say. He called it honest country, unforgiving if you're careless or unprepared, but fair in its way. The rules don't change with social standing or political winds." "Your brother sounds like he was a wise man," she observed. "Is he still ranching with you?" The familiar ache resurfaced, duller now with the passage of time but never truly absent. "No, lost him 3 winters back. Creek was frozen, horse broke through." "By the time I found him," Ross trailed off, unaccustomed to sharing this particular wound. "I understand," Beatrice said, her voice gentle. "Loss leaves spaces that nothing quite fills." Something in her tone suggested personal knowledge of such emptiness, and Ross found himself wondering again about the shadows that occasionally crossed her expression when she mentioned her father or her life back east. They crested a rise, and before them lay the watershed property, 500 acres of prime land cradling the headwaters of Fuller Creek, where it emerged from a series of natural springs before winding its way down through what was now Ross's ranch. The morning sunlight caught on the clear water, making it shimmer like liquid silver against the green backdrop of pine and aspen groves. "This is it," Ross said, reining his gelding to a stop. "The watershed land." Beatrice drew her mare alongside, taking in the panoramic view. "It's even more magnificent than my father described. No wonder he was so insistent that it remain intact rather than be parceled out." "Intact?" Ross turned to her with renewed interest. "What do you mean?" She gestured toward the rolling terrain. When the railroad surveyors were evaluating routes through the territory, they identified this parcel as having significant potential, not just for water rights but for future development. "My father purchased it primarily to prevent exploitation. He believed certain landscapes deserved protection rather than division." "That's unusual thinking for a railroad magnate," Ross observed cautiously. Beatrice smiled, a hint of pride in her expression. "My father was an unusual man. His fortune came from connecting places, yes, but he maintained a deep respect for the land itself. He believed in progress that worked with nature rather than against it." She turned to face Ross directly. "Which is why he would be pleased to know this land was in the hands of someone who understands its value beyond mere dollars." Ross considered her words as he surveyed the property that had been a source of both desire and frustration for years. With control of the headwaters, his ranch would be drought-proof, his herd secure even in the driest seasons. But the responsibility was enormous. This water source fed not just his land, but eventually joined the creek systems that numerous smaller homesteaders relied upon downstream. "Your father never intended to develop this land," he said slowly, understanding dawning. "He was protecting it from those who would dam the springs, divert the water, or clear-cut the trees that maintain the watershed," she confirmed. "When he learned that your ranch adjoined this property, he felt it was providence. The man who had saved his life through selfless action was the perfect steward for land that required similar principles of care." Ross dismounted, needing to feel the solid ground beneath his boots as he processed this revelation. Beatrice followed suit, loosely tethering her mare to a scrub oak before joining him at the edge of a small bluff overlooking one of the springs. "Miss Grayson," he began carefully, "I appreciate your father's intentions, but accepting such a gift still feels improper." "Then don't consider it a gift," she suggested, her blue-green eyes serious as she looked up at him. "Consider it a trust. My father believed in your character, Mr. Fullman. He believed you would protect this land not just for your own benefit, but for all who depend on its waters." The concept struck him forcefully, not ownership as possession but ownership as stewardship. It aligned with his own unspoken philosophy about the ranch, about his responsibilities to the land that provided his livelihood. "I need time to think about this," he said finally. "Of course," she nodded understanding. "Shall we explore more of the property while you consider? I'd like to see these springs up close." They spent the next few hours walking sections of the watershed land, Ross pointing out natural features and explaining the ecology of the region while Beatrice listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions that revealed both her education and her sincere desire to understand this territory. They ate Mrs. Whittaker's picnic lunch beside one of the bubbling springs, the conversation flowing as naturally as the water itself. It was the longest continuous interaction Ross had experienced with anyone in years, and to his surprise, he found himself enjoying Beatrice's company, her quick mind, her occasional flashes of humor, and her evident appreciation for the landscape he'd come to love. As they prepared to ride back to town in the early afternoon, Ross found himself reluctantly acknowledging that Beatrice Grayson was unlike anyone he'd encountered in the territory. She carried Eastern refinement without Eastern disdain for frontier life, and beneath her proper exterior lay a spirit of adventure and independence that resonated with his own values. "I've made a decision about the land," he said as they mounted their horses for the return journey. "Already?" She looked surprised. "I didn't expect." "I'll accept it," he continued, "but with conditions." Beatrice tilted her head slightly, curiosity evident. "What conditions?" "First, I want to pay something for it, not full market value perhaps, but enough that it's not charity." She began to protest, but he held up a hand to continue. Second, I want a covenant in the deed that protects the watershed in perpetuity, preventing any future owner from damming or diverting the springs or clear-cutting the forest that maintains them. This request brought a smile to her face. My father would heartily approve, and your third condition. Ross hesitated, uncharacteristically uncertain. That you tell me the complete truth about why you're in Silveridge. Delivering these documents could have been accomplished by any lawyer. Taking a teaching position in a remote territory when you clearly have means and education for far more comfortable circumstances. It suggests you're running from something. Or someone. The smile faded from Beatrice's face, replaced by a guarded expression he hadn't seen before. For a moment, he thought she might refuse or dissemble. Instead, she straightened her shoulders and met his gaze directly. You're right, of course, there is more to my story. She took a deep breath. I am indeed fulfilling my father's wishes by bringing you these documents, but I'm also seeking refuge, you might say. From what? From whom, actually, she corrected softly. My father's business partner, Harrison Caldwell, has been pressuring me to marry him since shortly after the funeral. With my father gone, control of significant railroad interests and investments would pass to my husband upon marriage. Understanding dawned. And this Caldwell wants that control. She nodded. He's twice my age, ruthlessly ambitious, and has made it clear that refusal is not an option he'll accept gracefully. The school position here was a fortuitous opportunity, legitimate employment far from Philadelphia, with the added purpose of fulfilling my promise to my father. Does Caldwell know where you are? Ross asked, a protective instinct stirring that he hadn't felt since his brother's death. Not specifically, he knows I've gone west to handle some of my father's unresolved business matters. A shadow crossed her face, but Harrison is not a man who gives up easily on something he wants. I don't expect my respite to last indefinitely. The implications were troubling. A wealthy, powerful man with business connections throughout the expanding railroad network would have resources to locate a woman even in remote Montana territory, particularly one as distinctive as Beatrice Grayson. Thank you for your honesty, Ross said finally. I understand better now why you came in person. Does it change your decision about the land? She asked, a note of vulnerability in her voice. No, he assured her. If anything, it confirms my instinct to accept your father's bequest, with the conditions I mentioned. Relief washed over her features. Thank you, Mr. Fullman, for understanding and for not judging my situation. As they rode back toward town, Ross found himself contemplating this new information with growing concern. Beatrice Grayson had come to Silveridge seeking safety and fulfillment of a promise. She'd found the latter, but he wasn't certain the former was as secure as she might hope. The frontier had taught Ross that distance alone rarely solved problems, sometimes it merely delayed inevitable confrontations. What troubled him most, however, was his own uncharacteristic reaction to her predicament. For years, he had maintained careful isolation, avoiding entanglements and obligations beyond his ranch. Yet here he was, already mentally calculating how he might help protect this woman he barely knew from threats that might never materialize in Silveridge. The Montana Territory had no place for such complications, he reminded himself for perhaps the dozenth time since Beatrice's arrival. But as they rode side by side through the golden afternoon light, Ross Fullman was beginning to question whether his long-held philosophy of solitary self-preservation was as immutable as he'd once believed. August brought scorching days and occasional violent thunderstorms to Silveridge, the weather matching the growing tension Ross felt whenever he considered Beatrice Grayson's situation. In the 3 weeks since their ride to the watershed land, he had found himself making increasingly frequent trips to town, for supplies he didn't urgently need, to check mail that rarely came, and once, most transparently, to inspect the schoolhouse roof before classes began. Each visit inevitably included an encounter with Beatrice, whose preparations for the autumn term were progressing rapidly. Their conversations, initially restricted to polite formalities and discussions about the land transfer, had gradually expanded to include his suggestions for adapting Eastern educational methods to frontier children, her observations about Silveridge's residents, and occasionally, more personal exchanges about books they'd both read or experiences that had shaped their perspectives. Today's visit had the legitimate purpose of delivering the signed and notarized deed covenant that would protect the watershed land for generations to come. Judge Hammond had raised his eyebrows at the unusual restrictions Ross had insisted upon, but had ultimately approved the document's legality with a knowing glance between the rancher and the schoolteacher that made Ross uncomfortably aware of how his interest might appear to the townspeople. The schoolhouse was empty when Ross arrived, but the door stood open to catch the afternoon breeze. Inside, evidence of Beatrice's preparations was everywhere: freshly washed windows, neatly arranged desks, educational charts mounted on the walls, and a collection of books organized on a new set of shelves that he recognized as the handiwork of Matthew Turner, the town's furniture maker. "Mr. Fullman." Ross turned to find Beatrice entering through the back door, carrying an armful of wildflowers. The weeks in Montana had already begun to transform her. Her skin had taken on a subtle golden hue from the western sun, and she moved with the more relaxed confidence of someone adapting to frontier life. Today she wore a simple blue cotton dress, practical for her work but still possessing the Eastern quality that set her apart from the local women. "Miss Grayson," he acknowledged with a nod, "I've brought the signed covenant for the deed. Judge Hammond has filed the original with the Territorial Land Office." "Thank you." She arranged the wildflowers in a stone crock on her desk, their vibrant colors brightening the austere classroom. "That must be a relief to have completed." "It is," he agreed, handing her the copy of the document. "The land is officially transferred, with the protections we discussed firmly in place." Beatrice accepted the papers, her fingers briefly brushing his. The now familiar spark of awareness returned, stronger than before. To cover his reaction, Ross moved to examine the new bookshelves. "Turner did fine work here," he commented. "He did indeed." "The town has been incredibly welcoming and supportive," she said, coming to stand beside him. "Mrs. Miller organized a book collection drive among the families, and even some of the miners contributed to purchase new slates for children who couldn't afford them." Ross nodded. "Silveridge has its rough edges, but there's a strong sense of community beneath the surface. Most people here understand that educating the children benefits everyone's future." "I've noticed you're more connected to that community than you initially led me to believe," she observed with a slight smile. "For someone who portrays himself as a solitary rancher, you seem to know everyone in town, and they all speak quite highly of you." He shifted uncomfortably at her perception. "Small towns make it hard to remain anonymous." "Doesn't mean I'm particularly sociable." "No, then how do you explain your increasingly frequent visits to town these past weeks?" Her tone was gently teasing, but the question held genuine curiosity. Ross found himself uncharacteristically flustered. "I've had business to attend to." "Of course," she agreed, though her expression suggested she didn't entirely believe him. "Well, whatever your reasons, I've appreciated your insights. They've helped me prepare more effectively for the term." An awkward silence fell between them, filled with unspoken questions and observations. Ross had never been skilled at the social niceties that came so naturally to Beatrice, and he found himself wishing for his brother's easy conversational abilities. "Have you received any correspondence from Philadelphia?" he asked finally, the question that had been concerning him for weeks. Her expression sobered immediately. "Not directly, but Mrs. Whitaker mentioned that someone had telegraphed the station agent inquiring about recent arrivals from Pennsylvania, specifically asking about unaccompanied women of my general description." Ross frowned. "Caldwell. Most likely. The inquiry came from a Chicago law firm that handles much of his business." She sighed, absently arranging the wildflowers with nervous fingers. "It was only a matter of time. Harrison has connections throughout the railroad network." "What did the station agent tell them?" "Fortunately, Mr. Parker is discreet and protective of Silveridge's residents. He replied that several families had arrived from various eastern states recently, but provided no specific names or details." A small smile touched her lips. He then added that our telegraph service is notoriously unreliable during summer thunderstorms, effectively discouraging further inquiries through that medium. Ross felt a surge of pride in his community's protective instincts, even as concern deepened about the persistent pursuit. "Caldwell seems determined." He is. Beatrice turned away, moving to the windows where the late afternoon light streamed in. Harrison built his fortune through relentless acquisition of whatever he desires. He's not accustomed to being refused. What will you do if he locates you? She was quiet for a long moment before responding. I've asked myself that question every day since arriving in Silveridge. The honest answer is, I don't know. I have no legal guardian now, no male relative to intercede on my behalf. While I have financial independence through my inheritance, the social and business pressures Harrison can bring to bear are considerable. Ross wanted to offer reassurances, to promise protection, but he was acutely aware of the limits of his position. He was neither family nor fiancé, merely a man who owed her father a debt and was developing an increasingly problematic interest in her welfare. School begins in 3 weeks, she continued, her voice strengthening with resolve. By then, I'll have established myself here, made myself valuable to the community. Perhaps that will provide some measure of protection, or at least give me time to determine a more permanent solution. The people of Silveridge look after their own, Ross said, offering the only honest comfort he could. Once those children are in your care, their parents will stand behind you. She turned back to him, gratitude evident in her expression. Thank you for that reassurance, Mr. Fullman, and for, she hesitated, then continued more softly, for your concern. It means a great deal to know I'm not entirely alone in this. Something in her tone, in the vulnerability behind her composed exterior, stirred an emotion in Ross that he'd been fighting since their first meeting. Before he could examine it too closely or guard against it, words escaped him that he hadn't planned to speak. You're not alone, Miss Grayson. The simple declaration hung in the air between them, carrying more weight than its 4 words might suggest. Beatrice's eyes widened slightly, a flush rising to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the summer heat. I should go, Ross said abruptly, suddenly aware of how the moment had shifted, of boundaries crossed that he'd promised himself to respect. I have work waiting at the ranch. Of course, she replied, composure returning though her cheeks remained flushed. Thank you again for finalizing the deed covenant. As he rode back to his ranch through the gathering evening, Ross cursed his own carelessness. In 4 simple words, he'd undermined years of careful emotional distance, of the self-protective isolation that had served him well since Michael's death. Worse still, he'd potentially given Beatrice Grayson expectations he had no right to encourage, not when her future remained so uncertain, and his own commitment to solitude so fundamental to his survival in the territory. Yet even as he berated himself, a traitorous part of his mind kept returning to the look in her eyes when he'd made that impulsive declaration, to the way the afternoon light had caught in her honey-blonde hair, to the surprising grace with which she was adapting to frontier life despite her eastern refinement. The Montana Territory had no place for such complications, he reminded himself for what felt like the 100th time. But as twilight settled over the landscape and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Ross Fullman was beginning to fear that his carefully constructed philosophy was crumbling beneath the weight of emotions he had neither invited nor anticipated. Emotions centered entirely on a schoolteacher, with secrets in her past and uncertainty in her future. The opening of Silveridge's school term coincided with the first hints of autumn, cooler mornings, aspen leaves beginning to gild at their edges, and a sense of anticipation that extended beyond the 37 children enrolled in Beatrice's classes. The entire town seemed to take pride in their new schoolhouse and their Eastern-educated teacher, turning the first day into an unofficial holiday with parents escorting their children and lingering to witness the commencement of formal education in their frontier community. Ross had no legitimate reason to attend, having neither children of his own nor younger siblings to enroll, yet he found himself riding into town that morning with a small parcel tucked into his saddlebag. He kept to the periphery of the gathering, watching from horseback as Beatrice stood on the schoolhouse steps in a crisp navy dress, welcoming each child with a warm smile and a few personal words that immediately put them at ease. She was a natural teacher, he realized, genuinely interested in her pupils, adaptable to their varied backgrounds and experience levels, and possessed of a quiet authority that commanded respect without intimidation. Even the Hanson twins, notorious troublemakers known for testing every boundary, seemed subdued by her attentive greeting. When the bell rang and the children filed inside, parents gradually dispersed to their daily tasks, leaving Ross alone in the schoolyard. He hesitated, uncertain whether to leave his small gift or return another time when his presence might be less conspicuous. The decision was made for him when Beatrice appeared at the doorway, having settled her students with their first assignment. "Mr. Fullman," she called softly, surprise and pleasure evident in her voice, "what brings you to our educational festivities?" Ross dismounted, suddenly feeling foolish with his modest package. "I brought something for the school," he said, approaching the steps where she stood. "Nothing significant, just, well." He handed her the parcel, wrapped in plain brown paper and string. Beatrice accepted it with curious eyes, untying the string and carefully folding back the paper to reveal a hand-carved wooden box containing a collection of river stones, each one unique in color and pattern, along with a small magnifying glass. "For science lessons," Ross explained awkwardly as she examined the contents. "Different types of rocks from the local rivers and streams. Thought the children might enjoy learning about geology, given how important mining is to the region's economy." Her face lit with genuine delight. "This is wonderful, Mr. Fullman. We have precious few science materials, and these are perfect for hands-on learning." She lifted one of the stones, a piece of rose quartz that caught the morning light. "Did you collect these yourself?" He nodded, unexpectedly pleased by her enthusiasm. "Over the years, my brother started the collection actually. He had an interest in such things." "Then they're doubly precious," she said softly, understanding the significance of the gift. "I'll make certain the children appreciate both their scientific value and the generosity behind them." Their eyes met, and for a moment something unspoken passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, of how their initially formal interactions had evolved into something neither had anticipated. Before Ross could identify the emotion, the schoolhouse door opened and a small girl with braided pigtails peered out. "Miss Grayson, Jimmy says he doesn't know his letters and needs help," the child reported solemnly. "I'll be right there, Sarah," Beatrice assured her with a smile before turning back to Ross. "Duty calls, I'm afraid." "Of course," he stepped back, reclaiming his emotional equilibrium. "I should let you return to your students." "Thank you again for the gift, Mr. Fullman. The children will be thrilled." She hesitated, then added more quietly, "Perhaps you might consider visiting during our science lesson Friday afternoon. The children would benefit from hearing about these specimens from the collector himself." The invitation was professionally appropriate, yet held personal warmth that was difficult to refuse. "I'll try to make time," he found himself agreeing, though teaching children had never been among his considerations for the week ahead. With a final smile that lingered in his thoughts long after, Beatrice returned to her classroom, leaving Ross to mount his horse and ride slowly back toward his ranch, pondering how a woman who had been in Silveridge barely 2 months had managed to disrupt his carefully ordered existence so thoroughly. The science lesson that Friday proved to be merely the first of Ross's increasingly regular appearances at the schoolhouse. What began as a one-time presentation about local geology evolved into weekly visits where he shared practical knowledge about the territory's wildlife, weather patterns, and survival skills that complemented Beatrice's more traditional curriculum. The children, especially the boys who had initially resisted formal education, responded enthusiastically to Ross's straightforward approach and real-world examples. For his part, Ross discovered an unexpected satisfaction in passing on knowledge that might help these young people thrive in the challenging environment they called home. More unsettling was his growing awareness that these visits had become the highlight of his week, not because of the children's eager questions or their obvious respect for his frontier expertise, but because each lesson meant an hour in Beatrice's company, observing her skillful teaching methods and sharing brief, meaningful glances that increasingly communicated more than their careful conversations. By mid-October, as the aspens blazed gold against the evergreen forests and the first snow dusted the distant peaks, Ross could no longer deny that his interest in Beatrice Grayson had progressed far beyond neighborly concern or obligation to her father's memory. The realization troubled him deeply. His life was ordered around self-sufficiency and emotional independence, principles that had served him well in the unforgiving territory where attachment too often led to devastating loss. Yet increasingly, he found himself inventing reasons to ride into town, volunteering for tasks that might bring him into Beatrice's orbit, and lying awake at night remembering the sound of her laughter or the way sunlight caught in her hair during their afternoon lessons. It was during one such lesson, with the children clustered around a table where Ross was demonstrating how to identify animal tracks using plaster casts he'd made, that Sheriff Miller appeared at the schoolhouse door. His expression was grave as he caught Beatrice's eye and beckoned her outside for a private word. Ross continued his explanation to the students, but his attention was divided, watching through the window as Beatrice's posture stiffened in response to whatever information the sheriff was conveying. When she returned a few minutes later, her face was composed, but Ross immediately recognized the strain behind her calm exterior. "Children, please thank Mr. Fullman for today's fascinating lesson," she said, her voice steady despite the tension evident in her shoulders. "It's nearly time for dismissal, so please gather your materials and prepare to depart." As the students dispersed to collect their belongings, Ross moved closer to Beatrice, pitching his voice low enough that only she could hear. "What's happened?" She met his eyes briefly, concern evident beneath her professional demeanor. "We'll speak after the children leave," she murmured, before returning to her end-of-day routine with deliberate normalcy. The next 15 minutes passed with agonizing slowness as Beatrice distributed homework assignments, answered last-minute questions, and bid each child farewell with her customary personal attention. When the last student had departed, she closed the schoolhouse door and leaned against it, the careful composure finally slipping to reveal genuine worry. "Harrison Caldwell arrived on the afternoon train," she said without preamble. "Sheriff Miller recognized his name from our previous conversations and came to warn me." Ross felt a cold knot form in his stomach. "He's here in Silveridge now." She nodded, moving to her desk where she began organizing papers with nervous energy. "Apparently he's taken a room at the hotel and inquired about the location of the school. He told Mr. Parker he has business with the new teacher." "How did he find you?" "I don't know for certain," she sighed, setting down the papers and facing Ross directly. "Perhaps someone in Philadelphia discovered my destination, or one of his railroad contacts traced my journey west. It hardly matters now." Ross considered the implications quickly. "What will you do?" "What can I do?" There was resignation in her tone, though her spine remained straight, her chin lifted in defiance of her circumstances. "I can't simply disappear. I have responsibilities to these children, to this community that has welcomed me." "You could leave Silveridge," Ross suggested, though the thought of her departure created an unexpected ache. "Move further west, perhaps to Oregon or Washington Territory, somewhere beyond Caldwell's railroad connections." "And spend my life running?" She shook her head, a strand of honey-blonde hair escaping its pins with the motion. "No, Ross. I came here partly to fulfill my promise to my father, yes, but also to build something of my own, a life defined by my choices, not by fear or the expectations of others." It was the first time she had used his given name without the formal Mr. Fullman, and the intimacy of it struck him forcefully, underscoring the seriousness of the moment. "Then we need a strategy," he said, the "we" emerging naturally despite his long-standing commitment to avoiding others' complications. "What exactly does Caldwell want from you?" "Control," she answered simply, "of my father's railroad interests, of the family investments, of me. Marriage is merely his most expedient path to those objectives." "Can he force such a marriage?" "Not legally, no. But Harrison has other methods of persuasion, social pressure, business leverage, the kind of relentless persistence that wears down resistance over time." She began pacing the narrow space between the desks, her skirts swishing against the wooden floors. "He's isolated me from potential allies in Philadelphia by spreading rumors about my mental stability after my father's death, suggesting I'm in no condition to manage my affairs independently." Ross felt anger rising at the calculated manipulation. "But he can't extend such tactics here. Silveridge knows you as you are, competent, dedicated, entirely rational." "True, but he doesn't need the town's cooperation, only mine." She stopped pacing, turning to face him with vulnerable honesty. And I fear what he might do if I continue to refuse him outright, not to me perhaps but to those who support me. Harrison is not above using intimidation to achieve his goals. The implication hung in the air between them, that Caldwell might target those in Silveridge who had befriended and protected Beatrice, particularly Ross himself, whose growing attachment to the schoolteacher had not gone unnoticed in the small community. "When does he intend to approach you?" Ross asked, already calculating potential responses. Sheriff Miller said he mentioned calling at the schoolhouse tomorrow morning. Her hands twisted together briefly before she consciously stilled them. "Saturday, when the children wouldn't be present." Ross nodded, a decision forming. "Then I'll be here as well." "Ross, no," she protested immediately. "This is my problem to solve. I won't have you risking Harrison's enmity on my behalf." "I'm already involved, Beatrice," he said quietly, the use of her given name deliberate, acknowledging the shift in their relationship. "Have been since the day you arrived in Silveridge." The simple truth of this statement seemed to affect her deeply. For a moment, she simply looked at him, her blue-green eyes searching his face as if seeing something new there. Then she straightened her shoulders, resolution replacing uncertainty. "Very well," she agreed, "but we approach this carefully. Harrison is dangerous not because he carries a gun or threatens violence directly, but because he uses power and influence as weapons. We need to be strategic." Ross was struck by her clarity and courage in the face of intimidation. This was not a helpless Eastern lady requiring rescue, but a woman of substance and determination who was asking for alliance, not protection. The distinction mattered. "What do you propose?" he asked. "I'll meet with him as planned," she said, her voice steady now. "But not alone and not without preparation. If you're willing to be present, along with perhaps Sheriff Miller or Judge Hammond as representatives of local authority, we establish immediately that I'm not isolated here as I was in Philadelphia." Ross considered the approach. "Judge Hammond would be better. He carries both legal and social authority that even an Eastern businessman would recognize." "Agreed," she nodded, some of the tension easing from her posture as a plan took shape. "And I should have documentation ready, proof of my legal independence, copies of my father's will establishing my control of my inheritance, evidence of my professional qualifications and contract with the town council." "Prepare as if for court," Ross suggested, impressed by her methodical thinking. "Exactly," a ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Harrison expects emotional responses he can manipulate or dismiss. He won't anticipate organized resistance with legal foundation." As they refined the strategy, Ross found himself increasingly aware of Beatrice's composure and intelligence in crisis. Despite her refined upbringing, she possessed a practical resilience that reminded him of the most successful frontier women he'd known, those who combined Eastern education with Western adaptability, creating something stronger than either tradition alone could produce. When their planning concluded and twilight had begun to settle over Silveridge, Ross walked Beatrice to Mrs. Whittaker's boarding house, both of them silent in the gathering darkness, absorbed in their own thoughts about the confrontation to come. At the gate to the neat white picket fence surrounding the property, Beatrice paused, turning to face him. "Thank you," she said simply, "for standing with me in this." "You would do the same," he replied, certain of this despite their relatively brief acquaintance. "Yes," she agreed softly, "I would." In the fading light, with concern for tomorrow's confrontation evident in her eyes despite her brave planning, Beatrice Grayson looked both vulnerable and indomitable, a contradiction that stirred something protective and admiring in Ross's chest. Before he could consider the wisdom of his actions, he found himself reaching out to gently touch her cheek, a gesture more intimate than any they had shared before. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he said, his voice low and intent, "know that you're not facing it alone." Her eyes widened slightly at the contact, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she covered his hand with her own for a brief moment, the warmth of her touch communicating more than words could express. "I know," she whispered. Then she was gone, disappearing through the gate and up the path to Mrs. Whittaker's front door, leaving Ross standing in the gathering darkness with the lingering warmth of her touch and the unsettling certainty that his long-standing commitment to emotional independence had been irreversibly compromised. The Montana Territory had no place for such complications, he reminded himself one final time. But as he mounted his horse and turned toward his ranch, Ross Fullman acknowledged that his heart had already made decisions his mind was only beginning to accept, decisions that would be tested most severely when they confronted Harrison Caldwell the following morning. The schoolhouse stood quiet in the crisp October morning, sunlight slanting through its windows to illuminate the empty desks and the three people waiting inside. Beatrice seated at her teacher's desk with Ross standing supportively nearby, and Judge Hammond occupying a chair positioned to suggest official capacity without overstating his presence. They had arrived early, positioning themselves carefully for the psychological advantage of receiving Caldwell rather than being confronted by him. Beatrice wore her most formal teaching attire, a high-necked dress of deep burgundy that conveyed both professional dignity and quiet confidence. Before her on the desk lay several neatly arranged documents, her teaching credentials, the contract with Silveridge's town council, her father's will, and legal papers establishing her independent control of her inheritance. The preparation lent her a calm that belied the rapid beating of her heart. "Remember," Judge Hammond advised quietly, "keep the conversation focused on facts and legal realities. Emotional appeals will only provide openings for manipulation." Beatrice nodded, grateful for the older man's willingness to lend his authority to her cause. "Thank you again for your assistance, Judge. Your presence means a great deal." "Silveridge protects its own, Miss Grayson," the judge replied with a kindly smile. "In the few months you've been here, you've proven yourself a valuable addition to our community. It's in our interest to ensure your continued service." Ross remained silent, his expression carefully neutral, though Beatrice could sense the tension in his posture. They had agreed he would speak only if directly addressed, allowing her to lead the encounter while his presence provided moral support and a subtle reminder that she had allies in this territory. The sound of approaching footsteps on the schoolhouse steps drew their attention to the door. A moment later, it opened to reveal a man whose appearance validated every concern Beatrice had expressed. Harrison Caldwell stood just over 6 feet tall, impeccably dressed in an expensive Eastern suit that looked jarringly out of place in the frontier schoolhouse. At 48, his dark hair was threaded with distinguished silver at the temples, his clean-shaven face bearing the confident expression of a man accustomed to deference. Only the calculating coldness in his gray eyes betrayed the ruthlessness beneath his polished exterior. He paused in the doorway, clearly surprised to find Beatrice not alone, but in the company of two men whose presence immediately altered the dynamic he had anticipated. "Beatrice," he said smoothly, recovering quickly and stepping into the room, "what a relief to find you safe after such a concerning disappearance. Your friends in Philadelphia have been quite worried about your well-being." "Mr. Caldwell," she replied, her voice steady and formal, "your concern is noted but unnecessary. As you can see, I am perfectly well and established in my position here." Caldwell's gaze shifted briefly to Ross and Judge Hammond, assessing them with the practiced eye of a businessman evaluating potential obstacles. "I see you've made acquaintances in your adventure. Perhaps introductions are in order." "Of course," Beatrice gestured to the older man first, "Judge Everett Hammond, who presides over the territorial court for this district, and Mr. Ross Fullman, a local rancher and valued contributor to our educational program." "Gentlemen," Caldwell acknowledged with a slight nod that managed to be both polite and dismissive. His attention returned immediately to Beatrice. "While I appreciate your hospitality, Beatrice, I had hoped we might speak privately about certain matters of a personal nature." "Whatever you wish to discuss can be said in present company," she replied calmly. "Judge Hammond has been kind enough to offer legal counsel, and Mr. Fullman has a vested interest in the school's continued operation." Caldwell's expression hardened slightly, though his tone remained cordial. "I see. Well then, to be direct, I've come to escort you back to Philadelphia. Your hasty departure has created numerous complications regarding your father's estate and business interests that require your immediate attention." "I'm afraid that won't be possible," Beatrice said, indicating the papers before her. "As you can see, I have contractual obligations to the Silveridge School Board for the remainder of the academic year. Breaking that contract would be both legally problematic and ethically unsound." "Contractual obligations can be addressed," Caldwell countered smoothly. I'm certain the good people of Silveridge would understand if family matters required your return east. A suitable replacement teacher could be arranged. There is no family matter requiring my attention, Beatrice stated firmly. My father's will is quite clear regarding my inheritance and the management of his business interests. I have appointed capable trustees to oversee those matters that cannot be handled by correspondence. Judge Hammond cleared his throat softly. If I may, Mr. Caldwell, having reviewed Miss Grayson's legal documentation, I can confirm that her affairs appear to be in perfect order. There seems no compelling reason for her to abandon her position here, particularly mid-term when the disruption to our children's education would be significant. Caldwell's smile thinned as he recognized the coordinated resistance before him. His gaze shifted to Ross, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, his posture relaxed but watchful. "And you, Mr. Fullman," Caldwell said, an edge entering his voice. "What is your particular interest in Miss Grayson's decision to hide herself away in this charming frontier outpost?" Ross met the older man's gaze steadily. "I believe Miss Grayson has made her position clear, Mr. Caldwell. She has chosen to fulfill her contractual obligations to Silveridge. As a community member who values education, I support that decision." "How admirably civic-minded," Caldwell replied with thinly veiled sarcasm. His attention returned to Beatrice, his tone hardening. "Beatrice, this charade has gone on long enough. Your father entrusted me with ensuring your welfare and the continuation of his business legacy. These arrangements you've made are temporary distractions at best, harmful to your long-term interests at worst." "My father entrusted me with my own welfare when he raised me to think independently and provided for my financial security," Beatrice countered, her composure unwavering despite the increasing hostility radiating from her unwelcome visitor. "As for his business legacy, the trustees appointed in his will are executing their responsibilities exactly as he intended." Caldwell's facade of civility began to crack, frustration evident in the tightening of his jaw. "You're being naive, Beatrice. A young woman alone cannot possibly navigate the complexities of the business world your father inhabited. Without proper guidance, you risk losing everything he built." "I am not without guidance, Mr. Caldwell," she replied coolly. "I simply have chosen advisors whose interests align with my own rather than conflict with them." The implication was clear, and Caldwell's expression darkened further. "If you're suggesting that my proposal of marriage was motivated by financial considerations rather than genuine regard." "I suggest nothing," Beatrice interrupted with newfound assertiveness. "I state plainly that I have declined your proposal and have no intention of reconsidering that decision. My life and future are here in Silveridge for the foreseeable future." A tense silence followed this declaration as Caldwell visibly struggled to control his reaction. Ross shifted slightly closer to Beatrice's desk, the movement subtle but meaningful, a physical reinforcement of the support she had declared. When Caldwell spoke again, his voice had lowered to a dangerous timbre that raised the hairs on the back of Ross's neck. "You should consider carefully the consequences of your decision, Beatrice," he said, each word precisely measured. "Your position here is precarious. A word in the right ears about your emotional state following your father's death, your impulsive flight west without proper arrangements, could raise serious questions about your fitness to teach impressionable children." Judge Hammond straightened in his chair. "Mr. Caldwell, I would caution you against making statements that could be construed as threatening or defamatory. Miss Grayson's conduct and capabilities have been exemplary during her time in Silveridge." "For now, perhaps," Caldwell replied, his gaze never leaving Beatrice. "But reputations are fragile things, especially for young women living beyond the protection of family or husband. One never knows what unfortunate rumors might arise." Ross felt a surge of anger at the veiled threat, but before he could respond, Beatrice rose from her chair, her expression calm but resolute. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, her voice steady and clear, "let me be absolutely transparent. Any attempt to damage my reputation or interfere with my position here will be met with immediate legal action. I have retained counsel in both Montana Territory and Philadelphia specifically to address such contingencies." She lifted a document from her desk. This affidavit, sworn by Dr. James Harrington of Philadelphia, attests to my sound mental and emotional health following a thorough examination conducted prior to my departure east. Similar statements from respected members of my father's social circle directly contradict the rumors you have already attempted to circulate. Surprise flickered across Caldwell's features, quickly masked but not before Beatrice had noted it with satisfaction. Furthermore, she continued, gaining confidence with each word, I have documented every instance of pressure you have applied since my father's death, including witnesses to your more aggressive persuasion tactics and copies of correspondence in which you implied consequences should I refuse your proposal. This was a carefully constructed bluff. The documentation existed, but was less comprehensive than she suggested. However, the uncertainty that crossed Caldwell's face indicated that he could not be certain what evidence she might have preserved. Should anything untoward happen to my position here, or should any unexplained rumors arise, Beatrice concluded, these materials will be immediately forwarded to your business associates, social connections, and the appropriate legal authorities in Philadelphia. I believe they would find such insights into your character illuminating. The schoolroom fell silent as Caldwell absorbed the unexpected counterattack. For the first time since his arrival, genuine doubt appeared in his expression, his certainty of easy victory clearly shaken. Ross felt a surge of pride witnessing Beatrice's poised strength. This was not the defensive resistance Caldwell had anticipated, but a carefully prepared strategy executed with confidence and intelligence. The Eastern businessman had clearly underestimated the transformation that had occurred during Beatrice's months in Silveridge. The development of frontier resilience combined with her natural intelligence and education. I see you've developed unexpected resources during your time in this wilderness, Caldwell finally said, his tone somewhere between grudging respect and simmering anger. The frontier teaches self-reliance, Mr. Caldwell, Judge Hammond observed mildly, even to those of us who began with Eastern sensibilities. Caldwell ignored the comment, his focus remaining on Beatrice. This isn't the end of our discussion, my dear. I'll be remaining in Silveridge for several days. Perhaps once you've had time to reflect more carefully on your situation, you'll be amenable to a more private conversation. My decision is final, Harrison, Beatrice replied, using his first name deliberately to emphasize the personal nature of her rejection. I will not be returning to Philadelphia, and I will not reconsider your proposal. The most productive course would be for you to return east and focus your considerable talents on your own affairs rather than mine. For a moment, it seemed Caldwell might continue arguing, but a glance at the resolute expressions of all three occupants of the schoolroom apparently convinced him of the futility of immediate further efforts. With a tight nod that acknowledged the temporary setback but conceded nothing permanently, he turned toward the door. Good day, Beatrice, he said stiffly. Gentlemen. Only when the sound of his footsteps had faded completely did Beatrice sink back into her chair, the composed facade finally giving way to reveal the tension that had sustained her throughout the confrontation. Her hands trembled slightly as she gathered the documents that had served as both shield and weapon. That was remarkably well handled, Miss Grayson, Judge Hammond said with genuine admiration. I've seen seasoned attorneys manage confrontations with less skill. Thank you, Judge, she replied, her voice steady despite her evident relief. I appreciate your presence and support more than I can express. The older man rose from his chair, collecting his hat. I suspect Mr. Caldwell will depart on tomorrow's eastbound train, his pride wounded but his pragmatism intact. Men of his type rarely persist when faced with determined opposition backed by potential public embarrassment. I hope you're right, Beatrice said, though uncertainty lingered in her expression. If you have any concerns about his remaining time in Silveridge, Sheriff Miller has been apprised of the situation, the judge assured her. Our community looks after its own, as I mentioned earlier. With a courtly nod to Beatrice and a knowing glance at Ross, Judge Hammond took his leave, closing the schoolhouse door quietly behind him. In the sudden silence, Ross moved to the windows, watching as the judge made his way down the street toward his office. When he turned back to Beatrice, he found her watching him with an expression he couldn't immediately interpret, part relief, part uncertainty, and something else that made his heart quicken despite his best efforts at detachment. "That was brave," he said simply, the words inadequate to express his admiration for her composed strength during the confrontation. "It was necessary," she replied, rising from her desk and moving to stand near him by the windows. "And made possible only by the support you and Judge Hammond provided. Harrison thrives on isolation, removing his targets from their support systems to maximize his influence." "You outsmarted him," Ross observed. He came expecting to find a frightened woman he could intimidate or manipulate. Instead, he found a strategist who had anticipated his every move. A small smile touched her lips. "Not every move," the affidavit from Dr. Harrington exists, but it's not nearly as comprehensive as I implied. And the documented instances of Harrison's pressure are primarily in my personal journal rather than witness statements. Ross found himself returning her smile, impressed by her tactical deception. Frontier justice sometimes requires flexible interpretations of available evidence. "A lesson I've learned during my time here," she agreed, her expression growing more serious. "Along with many others." A comfortable silence fell between them, the morning sunlight warming the schoolroom and casting dappled patterns across the wooden floor. Outside, Silveridge continued its Saturday routines, wagons passing on the main street, shopkeepers arranging displays, children playing in the vacant lots between buildings. "Do you think he'll leave?" Ross asked finally, voicing the question that lingered despite Judge Hammond's confidence. Beatrice considered this thoughtfully. "Eventually, yes. Harrison's primary motivation has always been practical rather than emotional. If he becomes convinced that pursuing me further risks his business reputation or social standing, he'll retreat to safer prospects. And if he doesn't?" She met his gaze directly. "Then we face that challenge when it comes." "I won't live in fear of Harrison Caldwell, Ross, not anymore." The quiet determination in her voice stirred something profound in him, admiration, certainly, but also a deeper recognition of how significantly Beatrice Grayson had changed since her arrival in Silveridge. The refined Eastern lady who had stepped off the train that June day remained, but she had incorporated frontier strength and resilience without sacrificing her fundamental character. "Whatever happens," Ross found himself saying, the words emerging before he could consider their implications, "I'll stand with you." The simple declaration hung between them, carrying meaning far beyond its surface promise of alliance against Caldwell. Beatrice's eyes widened slightly as she searched his face, perhaps sensing as he did that some critical threshold had been crossed in their relationship. "Ross," she began softly, taking a small step toward him, "I—" Whatever she intended to say was interrupted by a sudden commotion outside, raised voices, the rapid thud of running footsteps, and then Sheriff Miller's voice calling urgently through the schoolhouse door. "Miss Grayson, Mr. Fullman, fire at the hotel." The moment shattered as they both moved instantly to the door. Outside, smoke was already visible rising from the direction of Silveridge's only hotel, a three-story wooden structure that stood as the town's proudest edifice. "Harrison?" Beatrice asked sharply as the sheriff appeared on the schoolhouse steps. "No, ma'am," Miller replied grimly. "He's at the telegraph office, but the fire started near his room and it's spreading fast. We need every able-bodied person for the bucket brigade." Without hesitation, Ross turned to Beatrice. "Stay here where it's safe." "Absolutely not," she replied firmly. "Those are my students' parents and homes at risk. If that fire spreads, I'm coming." The fierce determination in her eyes made further argument pointless. With a quick nod, Ross accepted her decision, and together they followed Sheriff Miller toward the growing disaster that threatened not just the hotel but potentially the entire town of Silveridge. A crisis that would test not only their individual courage but the strength of the connection that had been building between them since that first day at the train station. The Montana Territory demanded resilience from all who chose to make it home. As they ran toward the billowing smoke, Ross realized that Beatrice Grayson had embraced that reality more completely than he had ever expected, and in doing so, had begun to transform his own long-held beliefs about survival, isolation, and the possibility of finding something worth risking everything to protect.